Long before the first dinosaur ever drew breath, the world already had its monsters. They prowled a red, half-dead supercontinent under a dim and hazy sun, and the largest of them carried saber teeth as long as your hand. We like to imagine that the age of great predators began with the dinosaurs. It did not. Long ages earlier, the very top of the food chain belonged to something stranger and, honestly, far closer to home. Because these beast kings were not reptiles at all. They sat on our own branch of the tree of life. The first true saber-tooth that ever existed was, in the loosest possible sense, a distant cousin of yours. To meet them, you have to travel back about 255 million years, into the closing act of a period called the Permian. Forget continents the way you know them. Back then, the land had gathered itself into one enormous mass, a single supercontinent called Pangea, stretching from pole to pole, with one world-spanning ocean wrapped around it. Standing in the middle of that landmass, you would have been thousands of kilometers from any coast, in an interior so cut off from the sea that the weather had turned merciless. Days that roasted, nights that cracked the ground with cold, and a horizon of dry, dusty plains running on with no grass to soften them, because grass had not been invented yet. The sky itself would have felt wrong. The sun was there, but it shone weak and yellowish, through a permanent haze of dust and volcanic gas. The air had grown thinner in oxygen than the rich soup of earlier ages, harder to breathe, especially for anything large. This was not a gentle Eden. It was a stressed, unstable, half-poisoned world, and yet against all sense, it was crowded with life. Hardship, it turns out, is a magnificent sculptor. The harsher the Permian became, the more extreme the creatures it carved. The seas told the same hard story. A few million years earlier, the oceans had already been gutted by an upheaval of their own, and by the late Permian, that great world ocean had gone strangely quiet, drained of its old giants and running low on oxygen. So this was a planet under pressure from every direction at once, on land and underwater alike. It is worth holding that in mind, because the monsters we are about to meet did not rise in a paradise. They clawed their way to the top of a world that was already, slowly, coming apart. For most of us, the story of life on land jumps straight from fish crawling out of the water to dinosaurs thundering across the plains, as if nothing much happened in between. But that gap is tens of millions of years deep, and it is where our own story quietly begins. The animals that came to rule this dry, dangerous world were not the ancestors of lizards or crocodiles. They belong to a group called the therapsids, and the therapsids are us, or rather, the far-off beginnings of us. They are the branch of life that would one day lead to every mammal alive, from a mouse to a whale to the person watching this. In the Permian, though, that branch had not yet learned to be gentle. It had learned to hunt, and the supreme hunters it produced were the gorgonopsians. Their name comes from the Gorgons of Greek myth, the monsters whose stare could turn a person to stone. And the comparison is fair, because a gorgonopsian was built to stop you dead. Picture an animal somewhere between a big dog and a bear in shape, but with a long, deep skull and a pair of curved fangs jutting down past its lower jaw. These ranked among the first true saber teeth the planet had ever grown, ages before any cat would copy the idea. What made them so dangerous was not brute strength alone, but a set of upgrades that put them a full step ahead of everything around them. Their legs were tucked in underneath their bodies rather than splayed out to the sides like a lizard's, which let them stand tall and move with long, efficient strides instead of a slow belly crawl. Their jaws did not simply clamp and hold. The teeth were edged and made to shear, to open a deep wound with a single committed bite, and then step back, letting the prey weaken before moving in again. It is a patient, almost surgical way to hunt, and it is exactly the strategy the saber-toothed cats would rediscover a 250 million years on. The most famous of these beast kings, and one of the largest, was a creature called Inostrancevia, known from the cold north of Pangea in what is now Russia. This was no house cat. A big Inostrancevia stood comparable to a brown bear, its skull alone reaching around 60 centimeters long, with saber canines pushing 15 centimeters out of its mouth. It moved on those upright, tireless legs over the open ground, and almost nothing it set its sights on had a real chance. I find it genuinely hard to picture. An animal with the body plan of our own distant family the size of a bear, hunting with knives in its face. It is the kind of thing you assume someone invented for a film, until you remember the fossils are sitting in museum drawers. Its prey were the great plant eaters of the age, lumbering, barrel-bodied reptiles like Scutosaurus, an armored tank of an animal covered in bony knobs, and the squat, tusked herbivores called dicynodonts that grazed and dug over the flats in their millions. Against a hunter that opened a wound and waited, even a heavily built giant was in trouble. The Permian was not a place where size alone kept you safe. Try to stand out there for a moment and watch one of these hunts unfold. The light is thin and orange. A herd of barrel-bodied grazers shuffles across the cracked ground, heads down. Somewhere in the low scrub, a shape the size of a bear has gone utterly still, every line of it built for one explosive movement. Then it comes, low and fast on those upright legs, and the herd scatters in a drum of feet and dust. There is no roar, no drawn-out struggle, just a single decisive strike, and then a patient wait. It is a cold, efficient kind of drama, and it played out across that world every single day. And Inostrancevia did not rule everywhere. Far to the south, in what is now southern Africa, an entirely separate dynasty of gorgonopsians had risen to the same throne, and they were, if anything, even more heavily built. The standout among them was Rubidgea, sometimes nicknamed the Lion of the Permian. Where the northern hunters were lean and elegant, Rubidgea was thick and powerful, with a broad, reinforced skull that looks, in fossil form, almost over-engineered. Two separate corners of one supercontinent, each crowned by its own sabre-toothed monarch, and as far as we can tell, neither of them ever had to look up and fear anything bigger. But the gorgonopsians were not alone in the killing business. Sharing their world was a second family of predators, the therocephalians, whose name simply means beast-headed. Lighter, faster, and sneakier, they were the cast's quick opportunists. Smaller than the great gorgonopsians, they made up for it with speed and adaptability, slipping between rocks, hugging the edges of shrinking lakes, and turning up almost everywhere fossils are found, from Russia to South Africa to Antarctica. If the gorgonopsians were the armored knights of this world, the therocephalians were its assassins. Some of them may have carried an even nastier trick. A handful of therocephalian species had grooved teeth and odd structures in their skulls that a few scientists read as a sign of venom, which would make them among the earliest known land animals to poison their prey. I want to be careful here because this is one of those ideas that sounds spectacular and is genuinely unproven. No fossil has preserved a venom gland. The case rests entirely on the shape of teeth and bone. So treat the venomous Permian hunter as a tantalizing maybe, not a fact. Even without it, these were formidable animals, and the largest of them rivaled the smaller gorgonopsians for the top of the food chain. One of the better-known, a stocky hunter called Mascarinus, traded the slender, slicing fangs of its rivals for a shorter, broader muzzle and a heavier, more crushing bite, a different solution to the same problem of bringing down struggling prey. The Permian was experimenting with every possible design for a killer at once, in parallel, on the same crowded stage. Down at the water's edge, the danger only multiplied. The drying lakes and sluggish rivers of the Permian had their own ambush specialists. There were slim, long-jawed reptiles that worked rather like an early sketch of a crocodile, lying half-submerged and lunging at anything that came to drink. And there were giant amphibians, the distant relatives of today's salamanders, blown up to monstrous size, some of them stretching several meters long, lurking in the shallows with only their eyes above the surface. The Permian offered very few safe places to take a drink. Land, shoreline, and water each had something evolved specifically to catch you there. Now here's the part that I think gets lost when these animals are filed away as just another set of prehistoric monsters. None of them were reptiles. Not the gorgonopsians, not the therocephalians, none of the beast kings at all. They belonged, as I said at the start, to the synapsids, our own great branch of backboned life. Look closely at a gorgonopsian skull, and you find features no lizard ever had, including the early architecture of a mammal's face. Many researchers suspect that at least some of these animals were already growing the first whiskers, perhaps even a covering of fine fur, to hold their warmth through those freezing Permian nights. We cannot prove the fur, the soft parts almost never survive, but the suspicion is reasonable, and it changes the whole picture. The first creatures to rule the land with warm-blooded ambition were not the dinosaurs. They were the rough drafts of mammals. You can read that transition in the bones themselves, if you know where to look. Over the long arc of the synapsids, the jaw was slowly simplifying, shedding spare bones, and some of those leftover pieces were drifting toward the ear, where, much later, they would become the tiny levers that let a mammal hear. Nobody planned it. Each small change simply worked a little better than the last. But it means that when you listen to a sound right now, you are using hardware that began taking shape in the skulls of these Permian beasts. Which makes what happened next even harder to absorb. Around 252 million years ago, this entire world ended. And it did not end with a wandering rock from space. It ended because the planet turned on everything living on it. In the region we now call Siberia, the ground tore open and began to bleed lava on a scale that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. For something like hundreds of thousands of years, eruptions poured out across an area the size of a continent in one of the largest volcanic events the Earth has ever recorded. It was not the lava itself that did the worst damage, but what came up with it. Those eruptions belched enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur into the air. The planet's temperature climbed and kept climbing. The seas grew warm and stagnant, and as they warmed, they lost their oxygen, until vast stretches of ocean turned into a dead, suffocating soup laced with poisonous gases. On land, the heat became lethal, the rains turned acidic, and the protective layer high in the atmosphere thinned enough to let harsh radiation pour down on anything left standing in the open. What followed is the closest the Earth has ever come to wiping the slate completely clean. Scientists call it the Great Dying, and the numbers behind that name are staggering. In the oceans, something on the order of 90% or more of all species simply vanished. On land, the majority of life was lost as well. Sabre-toothed kings, the armored giants they hunted, the assassins in the shrubs, the monsters at the waterline, almost all of them went into the rock and never came out. An entire dynasty of our own relatives, animals that had ruled the planet for an age, was erased in a geological heartbeat. And yet, the slate was not wiped clean. That is the quiet miracle of this story. Down in the burrows, where the surface heat could not fully reach, a few small, unglamorous survivors held on. Among them were stocky little tusked herbivores, distant kin of the giants that had once been chased over open ground, and they crept out into a scorched and silent world to find it almost entirely theirs. One of them, a barrel-chested digger about the size of a pig, became so common in the empty aftermath that its bones now turn up almost everywhere from that moment in the rock, as if a single humble survivor had been handed a whole planet to repopulate. There is something almost unbearably hopeful in that. A world stripped right down to its toughest, plainest occupants and quietly beginning over. From that handful of survivors, life slowly, stubbornly built itself back. And the next chapter to open was the one we know far better, the Triassic, when the very first dinosaurs would take their tentative steps. So the next time someone hands a child a plastic Tyrannosaurus and calls it the ruler of the ancient world, you can quietly disagree. The dinosaurs were latecomers. Long before them, a saber-toothed beast built on our own family plan already wore the crown, on a world that then very nearly burned to nothing. Every ruler this world has ever raised up, it has eventually buried, and the beast kings of the Permian are simply the oldest reminder of that we have. We happen to be the species recent enough to still be standing, and curious enough to dig up our predecessors and wonder, looking at those long, patient saber teeth, how secure and how temporary our own turn at the very top of the world really is.